All right. Well, hopefully you guys have enjoyed those questions. Those are some of my favorite things to do. It's part of what we do with our staff during staff meetings to get to know one another, and those have been some of the questions that we've asked one another that have helped us deepen in relationships. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that, and you got to know some other people in the church as a result. Well, my name is Blake. I'm one of the pastors here, and I'm going to start off this morning with a quote from a book, and this is from Philip Yancey in his book, What's So Amazing About Grace. I'm going to read this quote at length. He starts this way. He says, I told a story in my book, The Jesus I Never Knew, a true story that long afterwards continued to haunt me. I heard it from a friend who works with the down and out in Chicago. A prostitute came to see me in wretched straits. She was homeless, sick, unable to buy food for her 2-year-old daughter. Through sobs and tears, she told me she had been renting out her daughter, 2 years old, to men interested in kinky sex. She made more renting out her daughter for an hour than she could earn on her own in a night. She had to do it, she said, to support her own drug habit. I could hardly bear hearing her sordid story. For one thing, it made me legally liable. I'm required to report cases of child abuse. I had no idea what to say to this woman. At last, I asked if she had ever thought of going to church for help. I'll never forget the look of pure shock that came across her face. Church? She cried. Why would I ever go there? I was already feeling terrible about myself. They just make me feel worse. What struck me about my friend's story is that the woman and many like her were those that would flee towards Jesus, not away from him. The worse a person felt about herself, the more likely she saw Jesus as a refuge. Has the church lost this gift? Evidently, the down and out who flocked to Jesus when he lived on earth no longer feel welcome among his followers. What has happened? I remember reading this book years and years ago and feeling that same sting and that same shock, and probably for some of you, the same disgust that you're feeling right now. It hurts my heart. I have 3 daughters, and that thought is just agonizing to me and so, so sad. And I remember as I was prepping this week, one of the things that this brought up to me were the interactions that people had with Jesus. That people came to him in dire straits. People came to him when they were feeling down and out, when their life was not going well, in the midst of the muck and the mire and the struggle and all of the brokenness of their lives. They came to Jesus. And what they found there was someone who welcomed them, someone who loved them, someone who told them that they belong, who invited them in. And that's what we're going to get to here this morning. We're going to look at some of these interactions that Jesus has, and we're going to look at this extended text in Luke chapter 14, where Jesus tells 3 separate stories. And my hope with this is that I want to tell each of these blocks of the story and give a little bit of an explanation, and then when we get to the end, kind of give some applications, some things that we can kind of put a bow on and move forward. Because we've been talking for 5 weeks about hospitality. And this week, what we want to talk about is hospitality as mission. Meals as mission, the way that we can enter into these places the same way that Jesus did, with the same heart, with the same compassion, and invite people in. But before I jump into the text, I want to pray. So would you guys pray with me? Jesus, I know that that's a heavy story to lead with. It's hard for me to make it through that story, not in tears. It's probably my 5th or 6th reading through that this week, and it's still a struggle for me. But God, it's a struggle for multiple reasons. It's a struggle that there's people that are in that situation, but there's also a struggle that people don't want to come to you or come to us in the midst of that. I pray that that's not the case, God. I pray that we can be loving, that we can be compassionate, that we can be hospitable, that we can be the most welcoming place for people that are struggling to come and to find grace and love and mercy and compassion. And so, Lord, as we open up the text this morning, may our hearts be open to what you have to say to us. Lord, I'm mindful of some other churches in the valley, and just was praying on my way in for some of the churches. I pray for North Bible as Chad is installed as their lead pastor, and just pray for them in this transition, that everything would go smoothly for them. And we thank you for the ministry that they've had over the last 15 to 20 years. I pray for Jared at Desert City as he's preparing to go on sabbatical, that would be restful for him and for Marcy and for their kids, and that you continue to do great and faithful ministry through them. Lord, we are blessed to be in a city with so many great churches, with so many great people. We just celebrate the unity that we have and the common mission that we have, reaching people for you. Lord, this morning, if there is anything of me, let that fall away. Let me be hidden behind the cross, and let me speak your words, and may they come through loud and clear. I ask this in your Son's name. Amen. So go ahead and open up your Bibles to Luke chapter 14. We are going to be here for a while. There's a couple different texts that we're going to read, and we're going to end up making our way through 24 verses. And so it's a lot, but I want to break it up. And like I said, I want to give us kind of 3 different segments and describe these as I go along. And the hope here is that you keep this theme in mind, meals as mission, right? That we've been talking for 5 weeks on hospitality, and we've looked at how Jesus has approached these different meals. And one of the things that we've said throughout here is that Jesus ate his way through the Gospels, right? We've been sharing these different meals and the different things that Jesus teaches in there. And so today we want to look at how he approaches this as a missional opportunity. And one of the things that you can look at is Jesus' stated mission. What did Jesus come to do? Well, Jesus says that he came to seek and to save that which was lost. And so with that as a foundation, I want to read these first 6 verses and begin to break down this text a little bit. So Luke chapter 14, starting in verse 1, says this. One Sabbath, when he, Jesus, went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. And behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. Then he took him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, "Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out?" And they could not reply to these things. Okay, so for today, the framework is we are in a Pharisee's house. Not just a Pharisee, we're with a ruler of the Pharisees. Okay, so this is a person who is one of the religious elite, and he's one of the elite of the elite. He is one of the rulers who is teaching people the law of God. And a lot of times when you see Pharisees mentioned in the text, you see them with the scribes and the Pharisees. So the scribes are these people who were like the lawyers. They would dig into the law so that they could understand every nuance and every single thing about the law. And they kind of provided this theological framework for the Pharisees to teach off of. And so the Pharisees would use this control in order to domineer over people, that they would watch out and they would wait for them to make mistakes so that they could catch them in their sin and they could call them out in the midst of this. And so that's what's happening here today, is that you have these leaders of the Pharisees, and Jesus is in their house, and he is having dinner with them. And one of the things that the Pharisees liked to do was they would take these laws. So keep in mind, we're talking about the Mosaic Law, okay, the Old Testament law. There's 613 laws that are laid out in there. And what the Pharisees would do is they would take this law and they would say, we don't want to break this law. So what we're going to do is we're going to create other rules around this law so that we make sure that we don't break it. And then they would go around enforcing their rules in addition to the laws of God. And so it would get really, really heavy. You can imagine this idea of 613 things that you have to remember, right? I was in class a couple weeks ago and I was teaching on the 10 Commandments. And this is grilling doctoral level students on the 10 Commandments. Do you remember the 10 Commandments? And we couldn't get them in the class, right? It's this idea that we struggle to remember 10, so you can imagine how difficult 613 are, and then adding to that is even more insane. But what happens in the text, what they say here is that they watched him carefully. And it's this Greek word, paratereo. It basically means that they're watching him with malicious intent. They're watching him because they want him to make a mistake. They want to catch him and they want to trap him and say that he is breaking the law so that they can discredit him, that they can get the followers that have begun following Jesus and have left following them and bring them back in. But what they do is they're trying to put somebody in front of Jesus who is sick. So you can see the broken mindset of the Pharisees in this. The trap that they are trying to lay for Jesus is putting a sick person in front of him, knowing that he's going to have compassion and care and love for this person. He's going to heal them. Now, what they're trying to trap him in is that he's going to do this on the Sabbath day. Now, what Jesus asked them is really important because he knows their malicious intent. And he asked them this really simple question. He says, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" And at this point, the Pharisees know that they're trapped because they can't answer yes, otherwise Jesus would heal him and he'd be off the hook. They can't answer no because the reality is there wasn't a law against healing on the Sabbath. So if they were to say no, then they would show that they don't actually know the law as well as they think they do. The law that he would be breaking would be one of their own rules, not a law that actually came from Moses. And so instead, they opt for silence. Now, what happens here is this, Jesus goes up to him, and he epilobonomai, right? He grabs him forcefully, and he heals him. Now, the text says that he's suffering from dropsy, which is like edema. This is when your kidney, your heart, your lungs, or your liver begin malfunctioning, and you get swelling. You get fluid buildup in your body. And so this typically shows up in your legs and your arms, and the way that the text paints this picture is that Jesus grabs him forcefully where he's suffering, right? So it's probably in his ankles or in his arms, and the swelling goes away. He heals him, and he sends him on his way. And then he reminds the Pharisees, he's saying, why do you not have compassion? If this were your own son, even if this were an animal that you owned, and it were hurt on the Sabbath, if it had fallen into a well, would you not do something about it? How much more should we have compassion on someone created in the image of God? And it's such an interesting thing because there's a few different things that happen in the midst of this. Jesus touches this man who would have been considered unclean. He wouldn't have been able to go into the temple and worship because he would have been considered unclean. But what happens is Jesus, the Son of God, goes up and touches this man. And rather than Jesus becoming unclean by touching someone who is unclean, he makes the unclean person clean. He brings healing. Now this man would be allowed to enter in and to praise and to worship God. And the second thing that happens is he shows the Pharisees that they have fundamentally misunderstood the Sabbath. They view the Sabbath as this opportunity to rule follow even more, to double down on their rule following. And Jesus is telling them, no, Sabbath was not created for rule following. Sabbath was created for man. In the midst of this, to rest, but also to bring healing and to bring love and to show compassion. So this is how the dinner party starts. Is they're trying to trap him. They brought him in, and there was clearly malicious intent in bringing Jesus into this dinner party. Now, the next thing that happens is everybody begins to be seated. So pick up the text again. We're going to read from verses 7 through 11. This is the parable of the wedding feast. Now, he told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this person, and then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So in order to make sense of this parable in this text, it's important for us to understand how tables were laid out, how they would have these feasts together. So when they would throw these parties, when they would throw these feasts, they would set up their tables in a U shape, okay? And the head of the party, the person who hosted the party, would sit right in the center of the U. And then the distinguished guests, read this, the most wealthy people, the people with the biggest bankroll, would sit at their right and at their left. And the closer in proximity you were to the host, the more honor you were being shown in that place. And so what would happen is they would invite all of the rich and wealthy and powerful and influential people that they could to come to these feasts in order to honor them. And the reason they would do this is because this was a culture of reciprocation. So the intent was, I'm going to honor you, and I'm going to throw this feast, and I'm going to feed you my food, and I'm going to honor you. And then down the road, when it's your turn, you'll do the same for me. But enter Jesus into this story. And as Jesus is watching this all take place in real time, he's watching all of these Pharisees jockey for position at the places of honor at the table. And the creator of the world, the most important person in the room, takes the lowly seat. He takes the spot at the end of the table. And he tells them, those who honor themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And he paints this picture of how would you feel if you thought that you were really important and you took this place of honor right next to the host, only to be told, actually, there's about 15 people here that are more important than you. Move on down the bench, right? Get to the end of the line. And so he would have to get up, and he would have to walk and be embarrassed in front of all those people and go and sit in this place of shame probably rather leaving the party instead of continuing on in this. So you can imagine how awkward the vibe gets in the room, right? Jesus just called out everybody in the room, like, hey, you all think you're way more important than you are. You're not that important. This is what you should be doing, and none of you did it. And the only person that was left out of this conversation is the host. And so as not to leave him out, Jesus starts in on the host. And this is what it says in verses 12 to 14. He said also to the man who had invited him, when you give a dinner or banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. Now, as I just talked about, this is a culture of reciprocation. And so Jesus calls it out. He says, what you're doing is you're inviting people who can bless you back. You're inviting rich people, you're inviting your friends, you're inviting all these people who will in turn do the same for you. So in reality, this is kind of a selfish act, what you're doing. You're throwing one party for 10 people so that 10 people will then bless you in return. What you should be doing is inviting the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Now keep in mind, these are the last people that Pharisees would invite because they were considered unclean. Pharisees wouldn't interact with them, they wouldn't spend time with them, they surely would not invite them into their home. But Jesus is trying to flip the script on this. He's trying to tell the Pharisees, and in turn us, that these are the people that we need to be looking out for because we are these people. I'll get to that here in a minute. But there has to be this really awkward transition. And this is painfully awkward when you kind of understand what's going on. But in verse 15, we read this. When one of those who reclined at table with him heard these things, he said to him, blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. Now, it seems pretty innocuous when you read that text as it is. But basically what's happening is this person hears what Jesus is saying, right? He calls out everybody in the room. He calls out the people who are jockeying for position. He calls out the host, and in the host and telling everybody, he's saying, instead of inviting all these people, you should invite the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. And this person's like, hey, instead of feeding people that we don't care about, let's actually just hang out and have this meal. Let's not talk about feeding the poor. Let's not talk about spending time with the blind or the crippled or the lame. Let's just continue on in our meal. And maybe you've been around somebody that just makes these horribly awkward comments. They don't know what to do. And if you have never been around this person, you might actually be this person. So just be cognizant of the things that you're saying in mixed company. But it's this super awkward transition where he's just like, I'm so uncomfortable and I feel like I have to say something to break the ice. But Jesus doesn't let it go. Jesus doubles down and he continues on with this parable of the great banquet. Pick back up in verse 16. But he, Jesus, said to him, a man once gave a great banquet and invited many. And at the time for the banquet, he sent his servant to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is now ready. But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, I have bought a field, and I must go out and see it. Please have me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to examine them. Please have me excused. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. So the servant came and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house became angry and said to his servant, go out quickly to the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame. And the servant said, sir, what you have commanded has been done, and still there is room. And the master said to the servant, go out into the highways and hedges and compel people to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste my banquet. Now, Jesus makes these excuses that these people are making intentionally ridiculous. He goes over the top in making fun of what these people are saying. And I'm going to explain a little bit of each of these so that you can kind of understand. The first one that says that I have bought land, so please have me excused. Now, this is ridiculous for a couple of reasons. One, when you go to dinner, land doesn't disappear, right? It's not like he was going to go to this dinner and he was going to come out afterwards and was like, where's that plot of land that I bought, right? The second thing is, it's nighttime. He's not going to go out and inspect land at night. And the third thing is, he would have already inspected this. He's not going to buy land sight unseen. I just felt like buying land, so I just threw money at someone and was like, hey, do you have a piece of land that I can own now? So intentionally ridiculous. And it goes into the second person. The second person tells him that he's bought 5 yoke of oxen, and he needs to go and test them. Again, for the same reasons, it's ridiculous. He would not have bought them sight unseen. He would have tested them before buying them. You're not going to work at nighttime. It's not like you're taking oxen out in the middle of the night and saying, let me see how you sledge this thing, right? He's saying that all of these excuses that these people are making are terrible, but they pale in comparison to the third one. The third one is by far the most awkward. Now, some commentators would say that this person was married and they were having their own wedding feast. And the reason that that couldn't be the case is that what would happen with these banquets, the first invitation would go out. It's like an RSVP. So you would go and you would invite people and you would say, hey, I'm going to have this party. Would you like to come? And once you got the people that said yes, you would determine how many animals you needed to kill, how much food you needed to prepare, and you would begin the work on that. And once it was done, a day or two later, you would go and you would tell the people, hey, everything has been prepared. Now come and enjoy the feast. Okay, so all these people have already said yes, that they're coming. Every single one of these people has already made the RSVP of yes to come to this party. Now, this person saying that he's married, some commentators were trying to say, well, he would have his wedding feast and it would interfere with this banquet that was going on. Well, that's dumb because he wouldn't have said yes to the invitation in the first place. And secondarily, the host of the banquet would never schedule that over somebody else's wedding, right? It'd be super disrespectful and it would be this week-long wedding feast that people would partake in. So it's not something that he would have forgotten. And certainly, like, men are bad at scheduling, but you're not going to forget your wedding day. Like, oh, I said yes, but it turns out I'm actually getting married that day, right? Like, sorry, I totally spaced on that. Now, what he says is, in essence, what he is saying, and this is where it gets really awkward, is my wife and I have some business to attend to in the bedroom, so I can't come to your party. Now, you can imagine how horrible and awkward and weird that would be in our current culture, which is way more liberal than the culture that these people were growing up in. So this would never, ever happen. Now, like I said, Jesus is trying to give these absolutely absurd excuses that these people give to get the Pharisees riled up. And the Pharisees are hearing these excuses and they're becoming angry with this indignation about these people and how disrespectful and how rude they are, not knowing that Jesus is talking about them, because he hasn't revealed this yet in the midst of it. Now, there's a couple things that happen when Jesus explains this parable, right? The first thing is that he tells the Pharisees that those who accepted the original invitation will not be welcomed in. When they reject the second invitation, they're not going to be welcomed into the banquet. And the second thing that we see happen in the beginning of this explanation is that Jesus changes this into the first person possessive. He says it's my banquet. He's now changing it from this theoretical banquet to my banquet. Now, what I want to do is I want to explain the component parts of this because there's a lot of moving pieces and there's a lot of people that are mentioned here. And so in explaining the parable, hopefully we can kind of put some hooks in this. So the head of the banquet, the head of the household, the person who sends out these original invitations is God. Now, the way that these were initially sent out is they were sent out through the Old Testament prophets. Okay, the first invitation was sent by the prophets. This was what people were accepting. And what they were accepting was this invitation to the banquet being salvation, eternity with God, right? And so this is what they thought they were accepting. Now, the second invitation that we see is given by John and Jesus. Now, John is the forerunner of Christ, right? You see John the Baptist, who is proclaiming the one who is to come, right? He says his stated mission is to proclaim the path for him who is after me. And he is talking about Jesus. And when Jesus comes, Jesus tells people, and you can read this in John 14:6, that I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Okay, this is the invitation that Jesus is extending. This is what he is telling them, that you have been invited, but the way that you get in, the door through which you enter into this banquet is me. There is no other way to do it. And the Pharisees are saying, no, I'm not going to accept that. Now, there's a few other characters that we haven't talked about in the story. And these are the ones that Jesus said that need to be invited: the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. And I love the way that Tim Chester describes this in his book. He says this. He says, in this meal, we see God's grace to us. We're the poor, the blind, the crippled, and the lame, urged inside to join God's great banquet. We're the spiritually poor because we have nothing to offer for our salvation. We're spiritually crippled because we are made powerless by sin. We are spiritually blind because we're unable to see the truth about Jesus until he reveals it. And we are spiritually lame because we're unable to come to God on our own. So as those who have been invited into the kingdom with nothing, we bring nothing to the table. What he's telling us is we need to go and invite others likewise. We need to see others who are in our current state, and we need to go and extend that invitation. When he talks about the people that are blind, crippled, lame, poor, these were all people who would have to be compelled to come into this banquet because they would not normally be welcomed. And then when he extends that further, when he's saying go into the highways and the hedges, he's talking about those who are homeless, those who have no place to live. Extend that invitation to them. Bring them in so that they can enjoy this banquet with us. And remember the theme that we're talking about for today. It's meals as mission. Jesus is sitting at a table. He is reminding these people while they're eating together the importance of inviting those who are normally not invited, of showing love and compassion to people who don't normally receive love and compassion. When he's talking about evangelism, I love this quote from Charles Spurgeon. He said that evangelism is just one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. And this is a twofold truth. I say it's a twofold truth because physically, feeding people is a ministry. Meeting the physical needs of people and caring for them, inviting them in, showing them hospitality, showing them compassion, feeding them is a ministry in and of itself. It's really important for us to do that. Another thing that Chester says in his book, he says, when you combine a passion for Jesus with shared meals, you create potent gospel opportunities. I love that phrase, potent gospel opportunities. When he's talking about that, he's saying that meals create this chemical bond between people. When you are sharing food with somebody, it automatically puts them in a better mood. This is one of the reasons that if you're having conflict with somebody, you don't do it on an empty stomach. You sit down, you share a meal, you have snacks, and it sounds silly and ridiculous, but the reality is it works. We are in a better mood when we're eating. Can I get an amen? Right? So this is something that's important, but in the midst of this, what Jesus is saying is that it not only draws us together, it creates unique relational opportunities for us. We can build relationships with people better over the table. Now, the second thing is the spiritual truth of what was said by Spurgeon, that we have the best news that the world has ever known, and we need to share that. Knowing the gospel, knowing the importance of Jesus in your own life, how can you not share that with other people who don't yet know him? And a lot of times we don't do it because we're afraid. We're afraid of what might happen, that we might be rejected. But he's saying we need to press into these opportunities. This past week, Tim Keller went to be with the Lord, and I was looking back over some of his quotes, and this one from Prodigal God was a stinger for me. He said, if the preaching of our ministers and the practice of our parishioners do not have the same effect on people that Jesus had, then we must not be declaring the same message that Jesus did. And as I was thinking about that, obviously it's convicting, but it's convicting because it's true. And I'm saying that as I'm preaching, right? That if we are not ministering to people who are broken, who are hurting, who would feel far from Jesus, if they don't feel welcomed, if they don't feel loved here, what are we doing? We should be the best in the world at showing compassion and hospitality and love to people, reaching out to those who would be considered on the fringe of society and loving them well. We spent the last 5 weeks talking about hospitality. And through this, we talked about salvation, we talked about grace, we talked about redemption, we talked about engaging, we talked about how we can use meals as mission, how we can invite people in. Just for some framework on this, in every year, you have 1,095 opportunities to share a meal with somebody. 1,095 opportunities. Now, that may mean that you have to plan, that you have to budget, that you have to calendar these things in and think them through. But even if you were to do that 2 times a month, you would be amazed at what God can do through those times. Now, last night we had 20-something people over at our house, right? And this was not a fancy meal. This was not 12 courses on fine china. This was paper plates and plastic forks. Now, granted, that was the number one complaint that we didn't use our fine china because we don't own any, but people got over it. We were there to build into relationships with one another. On Friday, there were 3 different people who opened up their home to build relationships with people. It's this idea that when you open it up and you invite people in, you can build relationships over the table. How do you plan and budget and factor in doing that 12 times in the next 6 months? Now, I want to finish this morning with this quote from Tim Chester's book. I've been referencing a lot, but it's a book that Fisher and I use in prepping for this sermon series. It's called A Meal with Jesus. It's a short book. It's 100 and something pages. You should read it. It's fantastic. Another book this is more like shameless plug just because I love this book and I've read it multiple times, but it talks a lot about hospitality, and it's called The Gospel Comes with a House Key, and it's by Rosaria Butterfield. And she is phenomenal. She tells a story about her and her husband Kent and how they welcome people into their home on a weekly basis, that they just always have an open door that people can come over whenever. But we've been talking a lot about hospitality, and the reason we've been talking about hospitality is that we want to be a church that welcomes people in. The prayer that Fisher's been praying and has brought to our church, has brought to our staff, is that we are praying for people who are hungry and thirsty for Jesus to come here. And when they come here, that they would find Jesus among us, right? That we would be a people that are welcoming, that are loving, that are kind, compassionate, and we are seeing people as they are. But I want to finish with this quote from Chester because I think he takes a lot of pressure out of what we make things out to be in our heads. He says, Jesus didn't run projects, establish ministries, create programs, or put on events. He ate meals. If you routinely share meals and you have a passion for Jesus, then you'll be doing mission. It's not that meals save people. People are saved through the gospel message. But meals will create natural opportunities to share that message in a context that resonates powerfully with what you're saying. When we open our homes, when we open our hearts, when we feed people, when we show them compassion and love, we are putting the gospel on display. Then the words that we share when we actually present the gospel, that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, came down, lived a perfect life, died on the cross for our sins, was resurrected, raised on the 3rd day, now sits at the right hand of the Father on our behalf, that can take root with people because they see that it actually transforms the way we live. Are you allowing the gospel to transform the way that you live and welcoming people in, loving them, caring them, feeding them, showing them compassion? Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for this word. Thank you for these parables. It's always challenging to read parables because we want to read ourselves into the best part of the story. We want to be the people who are doing the right things or saying the right things. But the reality is, God, we get it wrong way more often than we get it right. And in that, I thank you for grace. I thank you that you show us compassion. And you help us along as we fumble through this thing called life. And Lord, as we think through what it looks like to be hospitable in our own lives, I pray that you would eliminate fears, that you would help us to embrace relationships, specifically with those who don't know you. One of the saddest statistics that I've read is after 5 years of being in the church, most people don't have unbelieving friends. How do we change that? How do we press in? How do we go to the places that you would go to? How do we minister to people that you would minister to? Inviting in the blind, the broken, the poor, the lost, and showing them the same compassion, the same love that you've shown us. So Lord, help us to put that on display. Help us to be a people marked by your love and your kindness and your compassion. Help us to plan our schedules, to plan our budgets, to treat meals as mission, to invite people in, and to love them the way that you loved us. We ask this in your Son's name. All God's people said. So during this series, we've been doing a handful of things differently, the name tags being one of those. But another thing that we've been doing is we've been sharing communion around tables. And part of this is an opportunity for us to see meals in this way, to see meals as mission, and to take the opportunity to pray with one another, to think through what this looks like. And so at the back of the room, you're going to see these 4 tables set up, and there's table hosts that are going to be there to lead you through this time of communion. And if you are gluten-free, Paul, right back in this section, has the gluten-free elements. For everybody else, you can go to any of the tables. And in this, like I said, the hope is just for us to take the space to reflect on communion. Jesus told his disciples in the upper room that when they took the bread, when they received the cup, that they were to remember him, that this is an act of remembrance of what Christ has done for us. And so in the next little bit, you can go back to the tables 6 or 8 at a time. If you see a group already there, you can just kind of wait until one of the tables clears. But take this opportunity to receive the elements together, and we will close with one last song here.